Thank you. So, good evening, everybody. Or I don't know, the time zones are different, so it may not be evening time for everybody. It may be morning for some of you. Here it is evening. So I've been requested to speak on the indigenous medical knowledge and its role in global health. So let me start, next slide please. Let me start with the context of indigenous medical knowledge. And there are two sort of contexts that are available. Firstly, there is this context where people are saying, how can anything other than Western biomedicine play a central role in the management of this particular condition of COVID? All other knowledge systems have no evidence that they can do anything. So let me begin with that context, and I am starting with a theoretical critique of biomedicine, and I'm saying something provocative. I'm saying that there is a myth of foolproof evidence regarding biomedicine. And why do I say so? So I start off by looking at both experimental as well as clinical pharmacology. And it is evident to anyone who is looking at, for example, experimental pharmacology, that all the bioassays that are used in medicine anywhere in the world, all these bioassays for testing anything are fragmented. I mean, whether it is a cell line, whether it is something which is in vitro, whether it is something on an animal, all our bioassays are fragmented in that they do not represent the actual biological phenomena. I mean, in general, you cannot mimic life in a laboratory. You cannot mimic nature in a laboratory. You can do lots of fragmented things in a laboratory, and we do them, but they are all fragmented. And so therefore, theoretically, there are limitations to how much you can extrapolate from the evidence that you generate in a fragmented part of the biological system, the bioassay, to the real life. You cannot generalize. It would depend on the quality of the bioassay and would vary from bioassay to bioassay. But in general, it is theoretically quite clear, at least to me, to my mind, that there are limitations in extrapolating from a fragmented bioassay in experimental pharmacology to the real life situation. We also know today the tremendous complexity of a single cell. I mean, at the end of this talk, I'll just show you, and many of you have probably seen these Google images of even a single cell and the complexity that you have, the biochemical pathways that are there in a single cell. And so therefore, given the interconnectedness, of the human biome, fragmentation and the kind of bioassays that we use, these fragmented bioassays, make it all the more evident theoretically of the limitations of experimental pharmacology in general. The limitations. I'm not saying that you cannot draw any conclusions. All I'm saying is that those conclusions that you draw, which you assume, have far more, validation than what they actually convey because of their fragmentation. This is on the experimental pharmacology side. In the clinical pharmacology side, it is very clear to those clinicians, and I think some of them may be in the audience today, particularly from the non-mainstream systems of medicine, and I am particularly going to refer to Ayurveda. You can see in Ayurveda clinical establishments all over this country and in other countries where Ayurveda is practiced to a very limited extent, in Europe and the US and Australia and Japan and so on and so forth, you can see that the clinical categories that are accepted in Western medicine, the classification, not really the clinical categories, but the classification of a disease in Western medicine is from the perspective of a system like Ayurveda, for example, is very, very gross. What we consider to be a homogeneous group as per the classification scheme in biomedicine, Western biomedicine, is in the Ayurveda, as the example I'm giving, in the Ayurvedic system, it is actually a heterogeneous group. And in any clinical establishment, what we have to do is we have to reclassify the patient, let's say of Parkinson's, who would in the Western scheme fall into two categories, either Parkinson's or Parkinson's plus. In the Ayurvedic category, we would have to subdivide this classification into several other subclassifications, and therefore naturally the interventions will be variable. And what is observed is that the clinical outcomes alongside this variable classification are generally seen to be good, perhaps better than the standard outcomes that you see in conventional medicine. So what I'm saying is that in clinical pharmacology, there is really a need globally to relook at the classification of diseases. And the proposition that I am making is that in the current scheme of classification, a group which is considered to be uniform, homogeneous, is actually heterogeneous. Now, to prove this, of course, you would have to look at that homogeneous group. You would have to look at the heterogeneous claim of, say, a system like Ayurveda. You would have to look at biomarkers underlining the reclassification of the disease and prove through biomarkers that there is distinction. We already know at the frontiers of biology that simply the difference in the genetic makeup of individuals, and there is huge variability on this account, you cannot treat the individual as the same. So this is the second point I'm making, that theoretically, even in clinical pharmacology, there are serious limitations because the limitations of the scheme of classification of diseases. Now, there is a lot of data that is generated because a lot of investment has been put, research investment is put both into experimental pharmacology as well as into clinical pharmacology. And so as compared to any other system of medicine, be it Ayurveda, be it homeopathy, be it, Chinese medicine, in comparison, you will find that the investments and the data arising from those research investments in Western biomedicine far exceeds the data that is available in any of these other systems of medicine. Lack of data is not lack of evidence, it's simply lack of investment. Now, the big data that is there does not necessarily translate into big evidence. It's because, to analyze that data, which is so fragmented, you look at meta-analysis that are done for management of anything. And you find that while there is a meta-analysis, the populations involved across that whole meta-analysis is relatively small, and you cannot generalize. And this is perhaps the central reason why you have frequent withdrawal of approved drugs that have gone through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, etc. The reason why there is this withdrawal is simply because of the limitations that I pointed out earlier of both experimental pharmacology, where the bioassays used themselves don't mimic life, as well as the limitations of clinical pharmacology, where the so-called homogeneous groups through inclusion and exclusion criteria actually represent a fairly heterogeneous group by a more refined scheme of classification, which may be available in other knowledge systems. I really think at this point of time, and this is the difficulty that we are actually currently facing in management of COVID. We don't really have today, for a completely new condition like this particular virus, we don't have any treatment protocols that are proven. There is no evidence behind any treatment protocol. We are repurposing things. The vaccine is, is a promise that is waiting to be realized, and we don't know when. And further, with the mutations that are now appearing in the virus, it's not going to be so simple to come out with a very specific vaccine. So we are in difficulty, and this is the reason why I suppose a topic like this has been chosen aptly for this particular conference, that what is the role of other knowledge systems? Can we dismiss them as being irrelevant merely because they do not have evidence in the form in which we require, which incidentally is not even available in conventional medicine? So I go on to the next slide. Malali, the next slide. There are limitations in Indian traditional systems like Ayurveda in respect of clinical evidence too, and that I alluded to that earlier. And the limitations are simply that today we rely on solutions derived from clinical texts of Ayurveda and from clinical practice that has not been documented thoroughly in terms of large data, large case studies, meta-analysis, and all this kind of thing. And the reason why they have not been documented is there's no investment. If you look at the national investment in any country, at least in India, and of what we invest in research on traditional medicine, it is a very, very small fraction. Not only in research, but even in practice. In India, for example, although we have this very fortunate situation of having 5 systems which are legally accepted as systems of medicine and healthcare, 97% of the national budget goes into Western biomedicine, and less than 3% goes into the other systems of medicine. So it's a very, very small fraction of investment even into healthcare. And of that small fraction, the amount that goes into research is minuscule. And this is the reason why, although there are clinical establishments, mostly in the private sector, which are very, very sizable, fairly sizable in India. I mean, we have more, as many, 700,000 licensed practitioners, which is just about the same number as the number of licensed biomedical practitioners in India. We have a large number of licensed licensed traditional medicine practitioners in India, almost as large as the biomedical practitioners. So despite that, the data that they generate through their clinical practice is extremely limited. And there is a need, that's the limitation today, there is a need to design and execute very rigorous clinical studies to show the, particularly the effectiveness. There is no issue on safety generally. There are not very serious issues on quality, although there are. But on effectiveness is the main area. That there needs to be very rigorous clinical studies done, and this needs investment. But the position I'm taking is that lack of data is not absence of evidence. Lack of data is simply lack of data. We don't know, in terms of hard evidence, whether it works or no on the basis of data. We are left only with so-called anecdotal stories. Next slide, please. I think that given the situation that we have in this country, where we don't really have, other than for acute conditions, good technology by way of ventilators and so on and so forth to manage acute conditions, and drugs for managing those acute conditions. We don't really have for mild, moderate conditions any proven remedies in conventional medicine. Whereas in Ayurveda, without claiming that those interventions that Ayurveda uses for mild and moderate conditions are antiviral, and we can't make that claim simply because no one has studied whether the interventions that we use in mild and moderate respiratory conditions have antiviral effect or no. No studies have been conducted to that. But there are thousands of people who are being treated for complex respiratory disorders and infectious diseases in general in Ayurveda. I mean, Ayurveda doesn't have the same perspective on health, on the human biology, as Western medicine has. Western medicine is a molecular perspective of the way changes happen in the biological system. It's brilliant in its understanding of cellular changes, which cannot be extrapolated to the entire system. In Ayurveda, we have a systemic perspective. It's not a molecular perspective. It's a different knowledge system. And I think at this point, not only in medicine, but in so many fields, it's very important that we look at plurality, we look at pluralism. This is very important for expanding, growing, deepening our understanding of nature and in social sciences of society. We've got to adopt pluralistic approaches, a monocultural approach, which is what Western biomedicine offers. However effective it may be for certain conditions, and certainly is for several acute conditions, for several emergencies, for surgeries, extremely effective. However effective it may be for these, a monocultural approach in the 21st century in healthcare or in any other field, really, theoretical fields like mathematics and agriculture to music and dance and cinema. A monocultural approach is completely out of place in a modern global society. We have to look at multicultural perspective on globalization. Um, And therefore, I think that the strategy in India, given our current limitations in conventional medicine, should be to encourage all systems of medicine to intervene in terms of conditions that they feel they can manage, which are largely the mild and moderate conditions of COVID. Send people who have got emergency problems to clinical establishments which have the technology to manage those kinds of emergencies, which the traditional knowledge systems and their clinical establishments do not possess. You won't find ventilators in an Ayurvedic hospital. You won't find oxygen lines in an conventional Ayurvedic hospital. And emergencies require, critical conditions require that kind of support, and therefore they should be referred. But for the rest, we should manage mild, moderate treatments with other systems of medicine. It should be actively encouraged. And prevention is one of the most important things. That while you are waiting for a very specific vaccine to appear, all these systems of medicine have an understanding within their own theoretical framework of immunity. And therefore, they have very sophisticated systemic concepts of immunity, which is really a futuristic direction, because we've got to expand the role of immunity from specific antigens, antibodies, to strengthening the innate immunity, so to say. And today it is innate immunity that is really coping with COVID much more than any drugs by any system of medicine. The reason why we have variable response across age groups, across populations. I mean, Asians appear to be relatively more immune. The death rate is far lower in Asian countries, probably because of their innate immunity and exposure in the past to a whole myriad of antigens. And immunity is what we need to focus on. And we need not be looking at immunity building only through the vaccine strategy. I am not discounting the vaccine strategy. It works for specific antigens and is rightly being encouraged. And well, the whole world is waiting for these vaccines to appear. But in the meanwhile, Ayurveda has preventive strategies. The government of India has issued guidelines, standard protocols for both prevention as well as treatment of mild and moderate conditions. Fortunately, government of India has also launched with the Central Council for Scientific and Industrial Research clinical trials on the treatment protocols. And we hope that in the next few months, we will get outcomes of those treatment effectiveness from those protocols. It's a very bold decision that the government of India has taken. But I think that for management of COVID, given the limitations that we are facing, there should be every encouragement given to every system, legal system of medicine. And in India, we should do so for Ayurveda, for Unani, for Siddha, for homeopathy, for yoga. All these systems must be encouraged to participate and intervene in terms of preventive as well as mild to moderate treatment. And they have developed standard protocols for this. They must be encouraged to do this. And we should broaden the medical base or the health intervention base for the management of COVID, instead of relying only on one single system of medicine, which does not, unfortunately, today at least have reliable solutions either for treatment or for prevention. And this is the time given to me. This is more or less my final slide, where I am making a case for reimagining healthcare in the 21st century. COVID is a provocation. It should prompt us to look at integrative health sciences and research in integrative health sciences. We need to break the silos across knowledge systems and deepen our health sciences. We need to, if we do so, there is promise for new frameworks for diagnosis and classification of disease. This is a very far-reaching development. I think the world is waiting for a much more refined classification of diseases to recognize variability where it actually exists, but where it is not being detected by the current schemes that we have for diagnosis, the current schemes that we are using in experimental and clinical pharmacology. We need to look at another area that is a promise for integrative health sciences, is establishing new theories of pathogenesis. This is a very, very unexplored area in conventional medicine. We know a healthy cell, we know a disease cell. We don't know the stages through which a cell moves from a healthy state into a disease state. We know when it has moved into the disease state, but we don't know the stages, the pathogenesis. In systems of medicine like Ayurveda, we have a whole theory of pathogenesis, which talks of pathogenesis taking place through 6 steps, which are described at systemic levels. Now, if molecular biologists and systemic scientists of traditional systems work together, as they incidentally do in my university has both extremely well-trained conventional scientists, biologists, chemists, microbiologists, functional genomics people, as well as people very well trained in Ayurveda. And we have a level playing field in which they respect each other and work together. I think the world is also looking for formulation or combinatorial chemistry drugs. We are no longer going to depend on, single molecules and single target approach for drug discovery. That, I think, is very simplistic biology. Given the complexity of the human biome, everything is multifactorial. And therefore, single molecule, single target will only work for very specific acute conditions. And you can't use these drugs for long. They will work only for very, very, very limited specific things. They are very important. They should be used. Anesthesia, for example. I mean, no amount of the plant source can give you that quality of anesthetic action that a molecule can give you. But single molecule, single target has very limited application. The future drugs that we are looking for are combinatorial. They have to be polymolecules, several molecules. And systems like Ayurveda are sitting on 400,000 polyherbal formulations. I mean, the government of India, the CSIR, has created what we call a traditional knowledge digital library, which is actually computerized. All these polyherbal formulations for their claimed effects. And that's a whole library waiting, to usher in a new generation of drug discovery. This is and of course, the last area for integrative health sciences is systemic immunity. I think we need to go from antibody, antigen kind of immunity to a more generalized kind of, and that's the biggest challenge that is facing medicine, that can we look at frameworks for systemic immunity that go beyond a particular antibody-antigen relationship. Now, these are the slides I had mentioned to you, the complexity of the human biome. These are the cell signaling pathways in a single cell. You can just see the complexity. And this one I won't try to explain, but this is the complexity of the Ayurveda knowledge system. This is a poster on systems Ayurveda, which shows all the logical relationships of, clinical concepts, and so on and so forth. And is showing you that here is the construction of a very different kind of a knowledge system based on a systemic understanding of nature and changes that take place in nature. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. And if the